Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Stephen Atkins, and you are tuned in to Zoom-A-Palooza through the Lincoln Memorial University School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And we are back for our afternoon sessions, and we have a series of speakers this afternoon, all in political science related fields. And our first speaker is a PhD candidate in political science named Simon Rotzer. He is, again, studying political science, and he's also working at the Howard Baker Center for Public Policy in Knoxville, Tennessee. He is studying in international relations and comparative politics, and he is from Augsburg. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Augsburg, Germany?
Yes, yeah, you pronounce it correctly.
Excellent.
Augsburg,
Okay.
Germany.
Sometimes my Southern accent is not what it needs to be with the foreign cities, but his research focuses on civil military relations in particular, and he wants to understand how the government, the public, and the military talk to and about each other, and what consequences these conversations have for society, the state, and international security. His dissertation focuses on why countries keep conscription during peacetime. Currently, Simon is a research assistant for the Minerva-funded project, Maritime Law Enforcement in the Indo-Pacific, building capacity to confront militia groups and maritime crime. So, Simon, thank you so much for speaking with us today, and I will hand the mic over to you.
Well, hi, thank you for having me. I'm just going to start this screen share here. I must share this one, and then we can kick off the presentation. Hi. I already had a wonderful introduction here, but just for the official record, Simon, compelling volunteerism, conscription in the 21st century, that's what I'm going to talk about here. This here. Okay. Content, you all want to know what it is exactly that I'm talking about. First, I'll give you a few more quick facts about myself, and then the big topic is conscription. We will explore what it is, why we should talk about it, or why people talk about it, why one would have it, or why one would not have it, words, how you get out of conscription, and there's going to be a few examples of conscription in practice right now. We're going to end up with final thoughts, and then I'm happy to hear comments and questions. Now, we already had a good introduction. My name is Simon. I'm a graduate research assistant for this really long research project here. Basically, what we're doing is we're investigating, we're collecting a data set on piracy, and we're investigating what piracy does to countries. It's pretty great, and it makes for some really fun stories on what people do and what gets classified as piracy. I do that at the Howard H. Baker Jr. Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I think I have to say that everything I'm presenting here does not represent their opinion and official stance. It's all on me. So if something works great, then that's awesome. That's on me. And if something goes terribly, then that's also on me. Don't blame them. Education, I have a bachelor's in arts and political science and social studies. I did that in Eichstätt, Ingolstadt, Germany, which, yes, that is a German accent. That explains it. I came here in 2016 to start my PhD in political science at UT, but I have been an exchange student before that at Maryville College. So that's why I ended up in East Tennessee, because people always ask me like how and why are you here? That is why. The South and East Tennessee is just fantastic. So this is great. And my PhD that I'm in the 6th year of focuses on international relations and comparative politics. And I'm right at the center of both of them, where they kind of connect, because I'm doing civil military relations. Civil military relations as a subfield basically deals between the relationship that a state and a government and a society have with the military authority. The basic question that guides civil military relations is who guards the guardians? Because if you think about it, military and the state, why would the people that have all the guns would listen to the people that have no guns? And obviously you could say, like in the West, they do, but why do they do that? What makes them behave the way they do? And that's what civil military relations does. I already had someone explain what I do. I'm looking at communication, the communication between the military, the public, and the government, and how they talk about and to each other. And I want to see what the consequences are. The question is, why am I doing that? It's easy, because like coming from Germany, we have a really particular way of how we deal with our military. It exists, but we really don't care much about it. One former president coined the phrase positive indifference. So it's great we have it, but yeah. And then coming to the US, just like landing in, I think I touched down in Charlotte, and then you had automated messages thanking soldiers for their service. That was completely new to me. I didn't know that that was a thing. You watched the NFL, I want to say October, when they have Military Appreciation Month, that would not fly in Germany. So that is what got me interested. My dissertation is on conscientious acceptance, the impact of public support on conscription. As was said earlier, I want to see why countries have conscription in peacetime. And my idea is that that has to do with public support, not just for conscription, but for the services that are connected to it, like alternative civilian service. Now, the main event, conscription. First and foremost, what is it? In really simple terms, conscription is compulsory military service. Basically, instead of, hey, do you want to volunteer for the military? It's, here is a gun, now go fight. It is forced enlistment, and it mostly is targeted at men. I say mostly because that has been the case for over thousands of years now, but there are no instances where conscription works also for women or includes women as well. For example, Bolivia, Israel, and also Sweden. The length of that forced enlistment, that varies. So it could be in an ideal case scenario in Turkey where you only serve a month after you paid a fee, or it could be up to a couple of years. And there's also different types of services that you do as a conscript. You're probably not going to fly a fancy new jet, but you could be put on the front lines, you could do supporting roles, you could do logistics and non-combative roles. It is everything and nothing at all that you can do as a conscript. Conscription, as I mentioned, is also a long-standing practice. So it's not something that just popped up a couple of years ago, but that has been around for almost 4,000 years. That is 1800 BC, when we had first instances in the Babylonian Empire where they forced men to serve and fight, serve the state and fight their wars for him. Universal conscription, which is conscription that affects everyone, was then first introduced in 1798 by the French after the French Revolution. They called it the levée en masse, which they then used to staff the military and take over parts of it, parts of Europe, that is. We also saw conscription in the world wars, World War I, World War II. There were lots of conscripts on both sides. Best example are the Russian conscripts that you see in all the movies that are just not having enough supply. Whether that was correct or not is not up to me, but there were conscripts involved on both sides. And then during the Cold War is when we saw lots of conscripts in the West and on the other side of the Iron Curtain, just because it is a really good way of bolstering your security. And there's different variants. You have cases where there's no conscription, and you have cases where there's full conscription, but you also have selective service that goes in the middle of it. We have it in China, we have it also in the United States. Now, the main question that some of you are probably asking, why do we even talk about conscription? Well, this is why. I stole this map from Wikipedia because they're just really great at doing maps. Everything that is, let's call it blue or turquoise or some teal is the word, is countries that do not have conscription. And then the purple ones are countries that have conscription, but only conscript 20% of the cohorts. And red is the countries that really conscript a lot and that obviously have conscription. And you can see we have full conscription in Turkey, we have it in Egypt, we have it in the Koreas, we also have it in Iran, and we have some sort of conscription in Russia, we have it in Brazil, we also have it in Mexico. And this is basically why we talk about it. I have a few more points. It is still prevalent. Looking at the map, that is exactly what it is. Roughly 1/3 of the world is still conscripting. So we should probably talk about that. But there's also countries that are introducing it. For example, Sweden got rid of conscription in 2010, but now they're reintroducing it. We have countries in the Arab Gulf that are now introducing conscription for the first time. Qatar, we're going to talk about them later, or the United Arab Emirates, excuse me. They also just brought back conscription. And then if you look closely at where Western Europe is, there's two red dots. That is Switzerland and Austria that just kept conscription since they became countries. But there's also current examples where conscripts are actually fighting right now. If you turn on the news, you're going to see it's Russia and Ukraine where this is going on right now. Russia fighting with lots of conscripts. Ukraine forbidding men to leave the country so that they can be put into the armed forces and to fight Russia. We also have conscripts fighting in the Yemeni civil war. That is Qatar, for example, that has conscripts there. And then we have a report that was just published 2 years ago by a commission here in the United States about Inspire to Serve that was thinking about ways to expand and modernize the draft here, not the draft, the selective service here. Now, why would one have conscription? First and foremost, if anyone asks, and if you want to take one thing away from here, it's security. It is security. That is why you have conscription, because it is a fantastic, quick, and efficient way to boost your military strength. You basically just take whoever you find on the street, give them a rifle, and then suddenly you have another soldier. It is also really common in terms of external and internal threat. External threat, we're thinking Russia here. For example, it could be in a hypothetical scenario, Canada trying to invade the United States, trying to bolster their military. Then you would probably see conscription coming up too. An internal threat we're talking about civil wars here, where when rebels are fighting the government, one or the other side, or maybe both, might engage in conscription just to have more boots on the ground. So the main reason one has security is because you need more soldiers, and that is the easiest way to do it. There's also economic benefits to conscription. I call it the endless pool of recruits, because basically you can tap a whole cohort. You can tap a whole age group, a whole generation if you want to. Like just in Sweden, there's 100,000 people in each age group, an age cohort, and you could just tap those, and then you multiply that by the age groups you have, and then suddenly you have over 1 million soldiers in power. So as many soldiers you need, they're there just for the taking. Conscription is also great because it allows the military to sidestep the actual labor markets, because they're not competing with any companies there. It also is cheap labor because you don't really have to pay conscripts a lot. You just tell them they're going to fight, and then they do that because they have no other choice. And competition with the job market basically means you as the military probably cannot pay a, let's call him software developer, $150,000 a year, but Microsoft, Google, Apple can. So if you really want that person, though, you just conscript them, and then it doesn't matter if you cannot pay the money, they still have to fight for you because they're required to do so by force and by law. And then there's the point that military training through conscription gives you training and skills that are useful later in life. So just turn on the TV and you will get leadership skills, teamwork skills. Maybe you learn a new trade, you learn to drive a truck, and that can be helpful once you're done. Here is a draft from my own work together with Ryan Grauer from the University of Pittsburgh. We have German conscripts over the years 1960 to 2010. If you look at that, the solid number is total conscripts, and the dotted number is the percentage of conscripts of the total force. And in the heyday of the Cold War, from the 70s to the 90s, well, to the mid 80s, you have almost 250,000 conscripts in the German military that make up almost 50% of the whole military. So if you want proof or confirmation that you use conscription to bolster or to make yourself more secure, then this is it. You have a lot of conscripts during times of external threat, which is the Cold War. And then in the 90s, you see the drop-off happen here. That's when the Cold War ended and when you suddenly didn't need those conscripts anymore. So the numbers are going down. Other reasons for having conscription, there's culture, and I call it ideology reasons. Basically, the idea is that you're doing a service to society. Was laid out in the social contract, if anyone has read or got to read in any classes. Basically, you as a citizen, you need to take part in the state, and you do that through service in the military. You're basically working for and with the state for the common greater good. It is also connected to citizenship, and we're going to hear that later when we talk about the Gulf countries, where individuals should have a stake in the state, and you get that stake when you serve in the military. Because you're serving not just your own interests, you're not just serving your friends, you're serving society as a whole. The German military coined a new motto / phrase called "We serve Germany," and it's basically the idea behind that. You're not just serving yourself, you serve the greater good, the greater country, you serve all of that. And it also creates social cohesion. You all went through conscription, you and your peers, you have something to talk about, you have something you can identify with. It makes you you, which again is something we're going to see in the Arab Gulf countries. And then there's civil military relations considerations. Conscription is a great way to guarantee civilian control or to facilitate civilian in the military, meaning that there's enough civilians in the military so that the military won't spin off into its own state, its own identity that just has its groupthink. And at one point realizes that why do we listen to the people without the guns? We have them all, so why would we follow them? And so cycling in civilians every couple of months is a great way of preventing that. Coup-proofing is basically what I just talked about, and also civilianizing the military. There's the idea that research has found that lawmakers that are just civilians and have no military background, they are more likely to use the military abroad in operations, but with varying intensities. But if you are a lawmaker and you have military background, so you're a veteran, then you are less likely to employ the military. But if you do, you want to go in full force. You're not just going to send a couple of people, you're going to send the whole army, the whole Navy, the whole Air Force to get the job done. And somewhere in there is a really good balance, which is something that conscription can help with, striking that balance between not always using the military, and then when using it, maybe not nuking everything. Here is also something from my work with Ryan Grauer. This is an example for how conscription can do well for society cohesion and civil military relations. It's German attitudes by age group from 2010, when conscription got suspended, to 2016. In the age group above, it's 16 to 29. You can see that positive attitudes towards the military, they kind of decrease from 2010 to 2016, and that is, 15 points that it goes down. But it's not only going down in terms of positive attitudes, the negative attitudes are also rising. So we have a 10-point increase from 2010 to 2016. Because those would usually be the generations that get drafted and then get a new idea, understanding, and maybe even appreciation for the military. If you look at the 30 to 49-year-olds, we see almost no effect, because we are going from 84 positive to 76 positive, and negative only goes up by 4 points from 16 in 2010 to 20 in 2016. And why is that important? Because the 16 to 29-year-olds, they're going to be the next generation to lead the country eventually. And you would want them, in an ideal case, to have some understanding of what the military does, just so that good civil-military relations are possible. Now, the trends that we can see here, I did some more digging on Wikipedia. They're just really good with maps. And the earliest map of conscription I could find was from 2008. If you want to look at that, they didn't do a lot of differentiation between different types of conscription in 2008. That's why there's so much red. They did more so in 2020. But what you can see, that conscription is still around, even though it has been on the decline in some parts in Africa. We also don't have Germany and Poland anymore. If you look at that, China kind of disappeared, and then a whole swath of countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, why would one end conscription? one of the main reasons is security. And you're probably now thinking, wait, didn't we just use it as an example of why one would have conscription? Well, that is mostly due to the changed security environments that we're seeing. When you have a conscript military, then it's usually really hard to participate in missions abroad. We had military missions in Afghanistan, we had them in Iraq, Europe did some dabbling in Mali, and like basically there's operations outside of your home territory. And you can only do those missions really if you have a professional military, because conscripts, they only serve for a couple of months, sometimes for a year or two, but that is really not enough to train them to be sufficiently informed, trained, and capable of doing things abroad. And then there's also deployment issues. A lot of countries have provisions that you cannot send conscripts abroad, not just because they're not trained, but by law, you're not allowed to do that. For example, again, the German case, you couldn't send German conscripts abroad. It's just the basic training, putting them in that, probably not going to go well. That's why you cannot really let conscripts do that. Pilots train for years, and conscripts only serve for a couple of months or 1 or 2 years. So this is why security and changed security environments might lead to an end of conscription, or be a reason why countries don't have it anymore. And then also there's the morale point. We need to differentiate between conscription for defensive and offensive purposes. We're seeing that in Ukraine right now, and I have a quote on the next slide for you. Basically, if you defend a country, the conscripts are great. Look at Ukraine. They're all not happy, but they're highly motivated to fight the Russians that are trying to, or actually invading their country. On the other hand, we have Russian conscripts that really don't want to fight because they don't even know they're in a war, or they're trying to figure out why they're suddenly in Ukraine when everyone told them they're just going to do some exercising in the west of Russia. We also have an issue with conscription because it usually leads to a higher casualty count. Horowitz et al. Did some research on that 10 years ago. They basically found if there's wars that are being conducted with conscripts, then there's way more casualties than when you conduct a war with a professional military. And then connected to that is decreased war support. And that just kind of makes intuitive sense, because if you are being forced to serve in the military, if your sons or daughters are being forced to serve in the military, then you're probably not going to be too happy if they come home dead. You're still not going to be happy if it's a professional military, but if they're being forced to do so, even less. And those 2 points, change security environments and changed, or like just morale in general, something why countries would end it. Here is the promised quote that I found in the Washington Post just that Saturday, and I was really happy to read it because we can use it here. I'm gonna read it out so it's easier for you all. One Western official suggests that Russian generals were also needed to push frightened Russian troops, including raw conscripts, forward. Earlier this month, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the defense ministry to withdraw conscripts from combat, having publicly pledged that they would not be deployed. This is out of an article about why Russian generals are getting killed in Ukraine, because Ukrainians are targeted them a lot. And basically, this is the motivation issue all over again, the morale issue. Raw conscripts are frightened because they're probably not sufficiently trained. They're getting a really low wage or salary for what they're doing, and they really don't want to be there in the first place because they didn't do it voluntarily. They were told, you're going to do this now. And then the second sentence perfectly confirms with what we heard about higher combat deaths and a decrease in war support, because all those conscripts that are dying, they are sons and daughters, and they don't want to fight, and that is just going to really annoy the crap out of annoy you as a parent when they come home dead. So this is just a good example, at least I thought so, for why morale is a problem with conscription. Then there's also economic disadvantages. We have a delayed job market entry. It also makes sense when you think about you finished high school, you finished college, you're ready to start a new degree, or you finally get that really awesome job. But then an army person comes along and tells you, congratulations, you're going to serve in the military now. You probably don't want to do that, but that's the military. And all the money that you could have made by taking up a job or pursuing another degree, that is basically wasted if you go and serve in the military as a draftee through conscription. There's also indications that the positive impact that military training has, what we mentioned before, sense of leadership, truck driving, or like technological skills, that they are outweighed by the skills that you would have potentially received in the private sector. Someone did some calculation there, and they said that if you would have not been conscripted and just stayed in and just did a regular job, then you would have earned more money. You would have given more money to the state, to the economy, than if you would have been a conscript. There's also the competition with the private sector. It's basically what I mentioned before, but the other way around. You're Google, Microsoft, Apple, and you really want that person that is really good at IT stuff, but you can't do anything because that person is getting drafted. So you will have to find a new person that might not be as skilled, a new candidate, or you might not fill that position and therefore make losses. So what is a benefit for the military is actually a problem for the private sector. And then it's also really expensive to have conscription. One might think, why? You don't really pay conscripts that much, but there is a whole process behind them. You have to house them, you have to train them, you have to give them a job, and that all costs money. And then also there's high turnover in the military that also makes things more expensive. Conscripts that are only around for 12 months, do you really want to train them to do an important, maybe logistics job? They're going to take a couple of months, and then they have 2 or 3 to do the actual job before a new person comes in. So economic disadvantages here. And then in terms of ideology, that is also a big thing. Conscription is seen as a violation of individual rights, because someone forces you to do something you do not want to do, and the something you don't want to do is fight and potentially kill someone else. There's also accusations of sexism in conscription, because it's mostly targeted at men. I mentioned Israel and Sweden before that, but it is still mostly men that are being drafted. And drafts can be really selective. I mentioned 4,000 Swedes being conscripted every year out of 100,000. Well, there's going to be plenty of thousands of Swedes that are going to be really happy with that low quota, but there's going to be 4,000 Swedes that are really not going to be happy that they got drafted. From my personal experience, I got drafted back in 2009 it was, and all the sportsy, we play football, we play soccer kind of guys that I knew, they all weren't drafted. But me and my friends that never did any sport in their life, just basically sat on their couches, played video games, we all were conscript material suddenly, all of a sudden. And that just like makes you doubt the whole process, because it's really unfair. Added to the ideological and cultural points that I just had, this is a survey that I found online about how would you fight for your country. The darker the red, the more likely someone is to answer yes to the question of would you fight. And if you look at Western Europe, for example, there's really not a lot of countries except for Great Britain and France that would want to fight for one country. And try to introduce conscription in Spain, try to reintroduce it in Germany, in Austria, well, Austria has it, in Italy, and then deal with people that really don't want to be in the military because they don't want to fight for a country. This is just going to cause a lot of issues, not just with the public, but with the conscripts in general. Now, we talked about what conscription is, we talked about why we should talk about it. We had advantages and disadvantages of conscription. Now we will focus on how to get out of conscription. If you or a country want to get out of conscription, there is one central place you should look at, and it's the United Nations. In 1966, they had the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In Article 18, they talked about freedom of religion, and that later on in a general comment was used and clarified that this is a reason why you should not be forced into the military. Because if you say your religion forbids you to shoot a gun or partake in military service, then that should be a valid reason for you not to get drafted. We also have the same thing in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where Article 18 says that there is freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And that is also basically the anchor of why there should be a general, no, not why should be, but why there is a right to refuse military service. You can find more information on the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. And one quote that I found that was really putting it all, that sums it all up, is the right to refuse to kill must be completely accepted, which is based on freedom of religion, thought, and conscience. And if you decide to object to conscription because of thought, conscience, and religious reason, you are going to become a conscientious objector. So that is an individual who has claimed the right to refuse to perform military service. That right to be a conscientious objector, even though it is a human right, usually is dependent on regime type. I have two graphs for you on the next slide that will explain that a bit more. But basically, if you live in a democracy, then you probably can claim the status of a conscientious objector, but not so much if you're in an autocratic system. And there's lots of variants in conscription and conscientious objection. The most, well, ironic, if you want to use humor on that topic, way is a non-combatant role, which this postcard you see on your right is kind of putting it together. So during the First World War, if you objected to military service because of your conscience, then, well, you'd still be serving in the trenches, but you probably wouldn't get a gun to defend yourself. Obviously, they didn't all serve in the trenches and clean them up, but this is the idea behind it. You would get a non-combatant role. Congratulations, you're fighting against the Germans without a gun. Another really kind of fun in its own sad way is you can object and then get to do time in jail. We're going to see that in Turkey later on. So there is no right to conscientious objection, and instead you refuse military orders, you are going to get thrown in jail. But the big ones that you can find are alternative civilian service, which is something that some of the Nordic countries were doing, that is something that Austria is doing, that is something that Germany did, where they basically put you in the social sector, where you could then work out your time as a conscript in a different entity outside of the military to still service or do service, but not for the military, for your country. And then you could also work in the emergency services. This here is from my dissertation, so straight from the draft to you all. It looks at conscientious objection and regime type. On the left, you can see autocracies, and in the right, you can see democracies. And the main takeaway here is the more democratic a country is, you see that on the right, the higher the chances that there are laws for conscientious objection, that they allow you to object to military service. On the left, you can see autocratic countries and the 0, 0.25, 0.5. It's just scales of autocratic governments. The more on the left, the more autocratic you are. And even though there are 2 instances of conscientious objection in autocratic regimes, it's really not that common. But then on the right, where you have democracies, it is more a thing. Now to an actual example so you can make sense of what I just talked about. How does conscientious objection work in 2 countries? I have Germany and Austria, Germany and Turkey, and we're going to start with Germany first. Draft was suspended in 2011. It's not dead, it's just sleeping. If you want so, they can bring it back, but there is no intention of doing that. And you can claim your status as a conscientious objector after you passed your physical exam, so you still have to do that. And there's variants, or there have been variants over time, and how you can object. Myself, I objected through an essay, so I had to put together a 2-pager why you couldn't serve in the military, and then you lay out your conscience, religious beliefs, and hope that whoever reads it will believe that this is truly your conscience speaking here, and they will free you from military service. There were a couple of months where they let you object to military service through postcards, and one could probably see how that might be an issue, because it basically was a postcard where you wrote, "I object." You sent that in, and then a couple of months later, you get a confirmation that you just successfully objected to civilian service. They didn't do that for very long, but it might have been a response to what they did before, which is a tribunal. And it was really that. So you, as a young 18, 19-year-old guy, you would have had to show up in front of a group of men mostly. You had an officer from the armed forces, you had your mayor or another important person there, and you had like an official of the state sitting there too. And then you had to tell them why you refused military service. And it wasn't just like, okay, just give us a couple of sentences, we're good. But you really had to dig deep and make your case. We all heard about examples that or like ways, strategies they used to get you to undermine your own case. And mostly was, well, you're walking at night with your girlfriend, you're in the park, and then there's a dude coming up with a knife and he's threatening your girlfriend, but there's a really heavy like piece of branch or so laying right next to you. What are you going to do? And then if you don't think about it, you're like, yeah, I'm gonna pick up that club, I'm gonna beat that person, I'm not going to let anything happen to my girlfriend. And then they're like, well, so it sounds like you're not objecting to violence in military service, then congratulations, you're going to get conscripted. So you had to find ways around that, of explaining that while you would probably take up the branch, you wouldn't just destroy one life by beating up that dude who wants to do something bad to your girlfriend, but you would probably also violate, damage, whatever you want to call it, yourself in the process, and it would scar you for doing that. And basically those were the things you would have to say to get out of it. The variants of alternative civilian service or of conscientious objection were the service I just mentioned. That was mainly in the social sector. We had people serve in the hospital. They would just cart people in their beds around from surgery back to their rooms. I worked in a workshop for disabled people, which was a lot of fun. I got to drive around. I got to drive them around in buses a bit. I worked with them. I helped them with their work, and it was just a lot of fun. But you could also do emergency services. Friends of mine did that. So instead of doing alternative civilian service in the social sector, they just worked in a variant of the local fire department for a while. And the length of all of that was as long as conscription, 12, 26 months at the end. This is conscription and alternative civilian service over time. In Germany again, this is a German graph that I translated myself, so that's why it might look weird. And the main takeaway is, in red, you see the number of people doing alternative service, and in black, you see the number of conscripts. And starting with in the year 2000, we already had almost as much alternative service people than we had conscripts. And then throughout the early 2000s, we had more alternative service people than we had conscripts in general. So that was a really interesting thing that people wanted to do because they didn't want to serve in the military. Then conscientious objection is a bit easier in Turkey because there is no conscientious objection. Quite the opposite. There's actually social stigma connected to it. So people will look at you weirdly why you wouldn't want to fight for your country. And refusal to service basically meant prison time. And this is where it gets really, again, it's sad, but it's also ironic and funny in its own weird way. If you refuse to serve in the Turkish military and they throw you in jail, you get out and they're just going to conscript you again. So it's not, well, you served your time in jail, you're done now, but you get to do this all over again. So you better just serve. There's a couple of ways to get out of military service, though. One that they just introduced a couple of years ago is you pay a fee and then you only do basic training for a month. Or you can permanently abroad and then get a waiver to just take one online course on the military and then you're done. People might ask how much the fee is. With the Turkish lira being really terrible right now, the fee right now is just $2,000. But when the lira was doing better, it was up to $30,000 that you had to pay. If you think about how not really good that is for people that are poor. If you're rich, then $2,000 or $30,000 doesn't really matter. It's like easier to pay. But if you're not that wealthy, then it's still a lot of money. Now we're going to talk about a few current examples in the last 5 minutes. We have Israel. There's a fantastic article that came out done by Ben-Ari et al. Last year. They talked about Israel being a volunteerized model. They still have conscription, but they want to conscript volunteers. They see the need for conscription, they have it, but they also know that people don't really want to be conscripted all the time. So they have 5 principles, 5 mechanisms. They only select, they don't select everyone. So if you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew or an Arab citizen, you don't get conscripted. If you have health issues, you don't get conscripted. There's honorably early discharges. So if they realize that the position that you're working on or for has too many applicants, that then they let you end conscription early. Or if there's an issue with your family, then you get to end conscription early. Elongated length of service basically just means they pay for schooling, education, and training if you decide to show up, if you decide to get conscripted, sorry. There's forms of voluntary service where they stretch that if you not get conscripted, but do it because you want to, then you qualify for better military units. You get to be special forces, you get to be a submariner if you join voluntarily. And then there's material and non-material incentives. You get frontline combat pay, you get nicer berets, you get honor insignia on your uniform if you want to, and that should make the draft more palatable. Sweden abandoned conscription back in 2010. Then they had the same issue that a lot of countries that end conscription have. They had recruitment problems because the attractiveness of the military and the career prospects aren't really that good, especially if you consider that Sweden has a great welfare and education system. So why would you serve in the armed forces to get education and healthcare? You can just have it for free by paying your taxes. They then reintroduced conscription in 2017 because of more external threat, and they modernized their draft to make it gender neutral. So now it is women that are also being drafted. In the Arab Gulf, we had conscription be introduced in Qatar in 2013 and in the UAE 2014. Kuwait brought it back in 2017. All was meant to improve security because the United States was shifting its attention away from the Middle East, and they wanted to pursue a more active foreign policy. And usually that means you have a bigger military. They also, there's a quote by a Major General from somewhere in that area who says, we want to create ideal citizens by having our male population serve in the military. So basically to enhance national service. You can only get out of there if you have health issues or if you are the son of someone who died in the war. And then my last 3 slides are going to be on the United States. You all know this, so we're just going to skim over it. There has been conscription for 6 conflicts so far. There was a peacetime draft that ended in 1973, and then the selective service system emerged in 1980. Now, are we safe from the draft? Maybe. There were some thoughts to bring back conscription during the Iraq War in 2003, where there was legislation or where people thought about legislation to have a draft, but public opinion is largely negative. There has been a commission, though, that just published a report 2 years ago, the National Commission of Military and National Public Service, that needed to or wanted to review the selective service process. And basically they recommend that defense needs to happen through mandatory military service. However, it should be the last resort in times of national emergency. So when Canada is knocking at the door, probably, maybe. They still say the selective service system should be the main process, though. It should be maintained, it should be made more fair, more equitable, more transparent, and it should be open to the registration of women. All of that should be under the guise of voluntary models. So before the United States is going to introduce conscription, there's going to be tons of announcement and campaigns that stress the need for volunteers to join. So it's not, conscription is not going to happen right away if it does. Final thoughts. Well, main takeaway number 1, conscription, just because we don't have it here in the United States doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It is a super efficient way to increase military strength, but it also comes with its problems. We talked about those. We should also take away number 2, that conscientious objection is a human right. It's not just me saying that, it's the United Nations saying that. And my number 3 takeaway, and it's the most important one, awareness of conscription is important. And we also should have debates about that. Should we have them every day? Probably not. Should we have them every 10 years? Maybe yes, maybe a bit more, but we need to have debates about it in case it will ever come back. And now I'm going to say thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much. Let's see. I'm going to hit a button here. So if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to share those in the chat box or in the Q&A. As I was listening to you, I had a few questions, and then some of them you answered along the way. So very good. I was on one of your earlier slides, you noted changes in, I think it was approval for the military in Germany over time. And I wondered how closely that tracked with maybe a measure of approval or trust in government more generally. Just if maybe, I wondered if approval of the military was also sort of a function of that larger feeling about the German government, or how those things interacted. So is that something that you've considered?
Also, this is a great point, and I feel like we could talk about that for hours. The German attitude towards the military is schizophrenic, if you want to use a positive term for it. There is, according to that public interest in those attitudes, the lowering approval or positive attitudes that mostly happened in the younger generation. But then you also have surveys that the German military publishes every year that are basically saying that the German military is one of the most trusted state institutions. Obviously, the least trusted are politicians, and like just use the United States, it's the same. But the military and the police and all those security organizations are usually the ones that are highly trusted. Which doesn't, like, how are you going to put that together? Germans have such a weird attitude towards the military, but then they trust it. But like, if you don't really care about your military, and if you don't want to see uniforms in public, like, why do you then still trust it? So yes, this is a great point, and there needs to be more done. And it is every year the surveys come out, just like, am I in the wrong? Are like the people that think like me in the wrong, or is the military doing something wrong? Why do they have such positive results? I'm not saying they should hate the military, but there's an obvious gap between what the survey says and what you see in public. One example, if I get that second, uniforms in public. I did an exchange here at the University of Pittsburgh. We did a field trip to DC in the morning, and we started out at like 6 in the morning. And I walked over campus from the bus station, and there were ROTC people just training outside, which is perfectly fine. But I was so surprised to see so many uniforms out there, like in public. Also in class or on campus, you would see people in uniform. And that is like, it's fantastic to see that. But in like, my first reaction as a German was like, why? Like, why are you in uniform? If you go back to Germany and you see soldiers like on public transport, see their uniforms, like, why are you wearing your uniform? Like, are we at war? Like, can't you just wear jeans and a shirt? So there's really weird attitude, and it makes it even weirder that the Germans trust the military so much. Sorry, I kept talking too much.
Oh, no, you're fine. We've got another question, and related again to the German example. Is there a difference in how women and men feel about the military in Germany?
They didn't really ask for that in the survey, so I really can't talk about it. I think it was always in general, and then it was age group, but I don't have anything on the military. There is, like, throughout the country, there is still that weird anti-militarism that I just mentioned. Not that you hate it, but it's like, why do it somewhere else, please? But no concrete information on women. But I will look into that. And if whoever sent that question, email me at the email that is somewhere, I can look into that and get back to you if that's okay.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so here is another question from the chat. Are a person's aptitudes considered when they are conscripted? Does this vary country to country? And then there's a comment. It says, in the U.S., service members take the ASVAB prior to joining service, and from that are assigned their specialties, or sometimes rejected because they don't achieve a minimum score.
Yeah, that definitely exists. So usually what you have to do, it's called muster. It's a physical exam where you have to show up. You get your draft letter telling you, congratulations, you get to show up to a physical exam in like military barracks or somewhere. Doesn't really use congratulations, but it's along those lines. Then you show up there, and mine said bring sports shoes and like sports equipment. And then you just go through a physical test. They test your eyes, your hearing, and you have to tell them you can tell them in advance if you want to object to service, and then you're done after that test. But if you don't want to object to military service, not just the German military, but in general, they will let you do those aptitude tests. There's more intense hearing tests. There's logic tests you have to go through. And then you will usually get after a couple of weeks, you will get your results that tell you how good of a soldier material you are. There's different categories. If the Germans have like grade A or type 1, where you're like perfect soldiering material, you can jump out of airplanes and stuff like that. I was category 2 or B, where it's like some deformities in your body, so you can't do the really cool stuff, but you can still soldier around. And if you have like flat feet or something like that, and a crooked spine, then you're not gonna get drafted. Like they're gonna throw you out and you're not gonna get drafted. So yes. The problem is it's also not really fair, because I talked about the sports dudes, and sorry, this is not a personal vendetta. The few sports dudes that got drafted, they did sports AP in high school and had to have doctor's notes saying they're physically fit to do AP sports. But when they got mustered and did their physical exam, they also had doctor's notes saying, oh, there's like sprains in the ankle or something like that. And it's just us unsportsy dudes thinking like, you are doing soccer for like fun and you'd get kicked out, but us, like, we're suddenly serving. So yes, there's the tests, and they happen.
Okay, it looks like we've got one more question here in the chat. Question is, in the US, the military in uniform appreciate it when they're thanked for their service. Do you see that in other countries? Yes,
that happens in other countries. I want to say South Korea as well. In Europe, I don't think it's that common, but then also I went to a conference, a civil military conference here in Washington, and I got to talk to a couple of German professors that are working for the German military. They serve too, and they said it's always such a pleasure to come to the United States, because when they figure out that you did service, then they thank you. Even though like you served in the German military, they still thank you for their service. This does not happen in Germany or some other countries. I couldn't name them now, but this is a very US thing though, like just Military Appreciation Month. We were watching basically the semifinals before the Super Bowl. I don't know what the name is. And they had that in Germany as well. My parents were watching. And then they called right after they played the national anthem, and they had a couple of military planes fly over the stadium, and they're like, did that just happen? Like, yes, that happened. That is perfectly normal here.
Okay. Actually, we have a few more questions here, and we'll try to fit these in. Have attitudes in Germany changed in the last month since the government has recently increased their defense spending?
There has certainly been more talk about bringing back conscription, which is probably just that talk. But Germans are now suddenly coming to terms with the idea as number 4 or 5-ish biggest economy on the planet and the number 1 economy in the European Union. We should probably also take up a bit of slack, or pick up a bit of slack in terms of the military. So we should invest in the military and do a bit more. In the past, Germans, including myself, were more pursuing a moral foreign policy, where it's like, you shouldn't really be deploying soldiers in that area, but like, if no one else is doing it, like someone needs to do it. And they're slowly coming to terms with that, but that's going to take a while. when our chancellor came out like a couple of weeks ago saying he's going to put down 100 billion extra for the military, that was huge. You cannot like possibly overstate how huge that was, how he just basically turned around throughout 20, 30, how many decades of German foreign and security policy. So it's not going to happen in the next couple of weeks. It's going to need a shift over time. But yes, there's already like people coming to terms with the fact that we now need to do a bit more. It's going to take a while, though. We've been pretty pacifist and still have a weird attitude towards the military.
All right, I'll make this the last question. You mentioned the offensive versus defensive differences between conscripts and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Have there been any other important lessons related to conscription so far in this conflict?
I really can't talk much about Ukraine. Just mention again the things that I said about how Ukraine is basically conscripting everyone now. If you want to get an awesome insight into the Ukraine conflict, then I'm a plug. Is it Wednesday evening? Dr. Erin Rowland Carlin, who's going to talk about the Ukraine conflict. She might even be here. So show up there, ask her that question. She's the expert on that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for plugging another one of our speakers that, yes, is in the audience today. And hello. So I'm going to wrap up here. Where can we find out more about your work and what you're doing? And when are you defending your dissertation and all that?
Defending in August, knock on wood. But if you want to learn more, then it's simonrotzer.com. So first name, last name, no dots in the middle.com. Or just email me. There might be an email in the program you have, or it's online. Just email me if you have questions, comment, mean words, good words. I'm happy to hear those. So just email away.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Simon. This has been an awesome talk. I really very much enjoyed this.